After the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 years ago, the first people began to settle in what is now Finland. Around 8500 BC, groups of hunters and gatherers from the south and southwest moved into the glacier-free area, and these first settlers lived in small mobile groups and followed the seasons and the migrations of wild animals. The landscape was characterized by vast forests and numerous lakes and rivers, which not only provided food but also served as transportation routes. Archaeological finds from this period, such as fireplaces, stone tools, file tips, fish hooks, and primitive dwellings, testify that these early people survived and adapted to the often harsh climatic conditions, and it appears that areas along the coastline and major inland waterways were particularly favored settlements. Although the first inhabitants of Finland left no written evidence, their material remains provide valuable insights into a culture closely connected to nature. Tarakli pottery culture. Around 5100 BC, in what is now Finland, the combed pottery culture developed, named after the typical decorations on the pottery carved into the surface with comb-like tools, marking the beginning of the Neolithic period in the region. However, people continued to live as hunters, fishermen, and gatherers, and were not yet engaged in agriculture. The culture of scalloped pottery quickly spread across most of Finland and characterized the life of the population for several millennia. People made elaborately decorated ceramic vessels that served not only as practical utensils, but also gave clues about their cultural and social ideas. And although it was a Stone Age hunter culture, archaeological finds show that society was already organized in a rather complex way. People lived in seasonal settlements, hunted deer and reindeer, fished in many lakes and rivers, and gathered plants. Tools and weapons made of flint and bone were also part of everyday life, and the Kam pottery culture represents an important period in Finland's early history, both because of technological innovations and because it contains cultural features that link prehistoric Finland to other regions in northern and eastern Europe. Impact of the Corded Ware culture. From around 3200 BC, the Corded Ware culture reached what is now Finland, named after the typical cord marks on pottery, and spread from Central Europe through the Baltic region to Scandinavia. In Finland, it encountered the existing scalloped ware culture and permanently changed the cultural landscape of the region. The carriers of the corded ware culture probably came from what is now the Baltic region and brought with them new technologies, social structures, and ways of life as farmers and cattle breeders, in contrast to the previous hunter-gatherer society. They brought with them not only a new way of making pottery, but also the use of livestock, new tools made of stone and bone, and the first forms of settlement. The changes in burial culture are particularly striking. The dead are now buried in individual graves and often accompanied by grave goods such as weapons, tools, and jewelry. This practice indicates a more differentiated social structure, with certain individuals having a higher social status. Genetic studies also show that the indigenous population mixed with immigrant groups during this period. Beginning of the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age began in what is now Finland around 1700 BC and was initially most noticeable in the southern coastal regions. The transition to the Bronze Age was gradual, as Finland lacked significant quantities of copper and tin, the two metals from which bronze is made, and the necessary raw materials and finished bronze objects entered the country via extensive trade networks, especially along the Baltic Sea. Traces of this new period can be seen especially in southwestern Finland and Sharonmere. Bronze tools, weapons, jewelry, and burial finds testify to a growing cultural exchange with other parts of Europe, with daggers, axes, and hatchets showing strong similarities with finds from Scandinavia and Central Europe. Burial customs also changed. In some areas, stone burial mounds appeared, interpreted as status symbols of the Bronze Age elite, and despite these innovations, the lives of many people continued to be strongly characterized by traditional hunting and fishing lifestyles, especially in the interior and more northern regions. The use of bronze spread slowly, and stone tools continued to be widely used in everyday life. However, the beginning of the Bronze Age ushered in a new phase of cultural development in which Finland became more closely linked economically, technologically, and culturally with the rest of Europe. The Iron Age and trade contacts. With the beginning of the Iron Age around 500 BC, the use of iron slowly but steadily became established in what is now Finland. The new material made possible more robust tools and weapons that transform both everyday life and warfare, and Iron Age settlements spread, especially in the southern and western parts of Finland, whose inhabitants practiced agriculture, animal husbandry, hunting, and fishing. Trade connections also intensified during this period. Finland became part of the wider Baltic Sea trade, linking it to Scandinavia, the Baltic, and parts of Central Europe, and excavations have documented the exchange of goods exported from Finland, including jewelry, glass beads, bronze and ironware, as well as possibly furs and animal products. Particularly noteworthy are the grave goods from this period, which consist of imported artifacts and indicate a certain wealth of individuals or families. The Iron Age was not only a period of economic and technical development, but also of cultural change, with the development of independent traditions in arts, crafts, and burial customs. Some regions, especially in the southwest, were more closely intertwined with Germanic and Scandinavian cultural areas, while others remained more strongly characterized by Finno-Ugric influences. The Viking Age. The Viking Age, which lasted from about the 8th to the 11th century, was a formative period for Northern Europe, and Finland was not unaffected by its events. During this period, the region saw many influences from the Vikings, who were primarily known as warriors, traders, and explorers. The Finnish population during this period consisted of several different groups, including the Finns, Tavastians, Karelians, and Sami, each of whom developed their own cultural and social structures. The Tavastians lived in southern Finland and were one of the most important ethnic groups in the region. They were known as farmers and fishermen who took advantage of the fertile land and numerous lakes and rivers in southern Finland. The Karelians, who settled mainly in the eastern part of the country, on what is now the Russian border, had closer relations with the Slavic peoples and maintained trade and cultural contacts with the Grand Duchy of Kiev and later the Grand Duchy of Moscow. The Samis, who lived in northern Finland and neighboring areas of Norway and Sweden, had a nomadic lifestyle based mainly on reindeer herding. Trade was an important aspect of these relations, and the Vikings brought in goods in demand in Finland, such as furs, metals, jewelry, and wool, while at the same time exporting resources such as honey, beeswax, furs, and wood. Finland was also a central point of the Viking trade network, along important trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea to large areas of modern-day Russia and Scandinavia. During the Viking expansion, Scandinavian peoples began to increase their presence in Finland, and there is evidence that the Vikings established settlements in Finland, especially along the Finnish coast. Especially in the southern part of the country, there were connections between the Vikings and the Tavastians, which led to a mixing of culture, technology, and trade. The Vikings brought advanced agricultural techniques and new methods of production, such as shipbuilding, which had a lasting impact on Finnish society. And an important factor was the development of trade routes used by the Vikings to connect Finland with the rest of Scandinavia and the rest of Europe. These trade routes led to a more intensive exchange of goods and ideas and helped to further integrate Finland into the wider Nordic and European economy. At the same time, however, Finland was not only the target of Viking trade and plundering expeditions, but also became involved in these activities itself, with some Finnish groups, notably the Tavastians, joining the campaigns in Scandinavia. There are reports of Finnish warriors fighting in Scandinavian armies and establishing settlements in Scandinavia. Swedish Crusades. From 1154 onwards, the Swedish kings began to organize more crusades to Finland, and these military efforts, often referred to as the Swedish Crusades, had several goals: the spread of Christianity, the expansion of Swedish influence, and territorial expansion in the Baltic Sea region. The Crusades were seen as a continuation of the Christian missionary work in the north that had already taken place in other parts of Scandinavia, such as Norway and Denmark, and the First Crusade, referred to as such by Swedish tradition and later historiographers, took place around 1154. This crusade was led by King Eric IX of Sweden, also known as Saint Eric, and Bishop Henry of Uppsala. Its aim was to Christianize pagan Finland and incorporate it into Sweden's sphere of influence, but there are doubts as to how exactly this crusade was carried out historically, as there are no concrete sources from that period that provide detailed information. Nevertheless, it remains an important part of the national legend and symbolism of Swedish expansionism. Sweden organized other military expeditions into Finland during the 13th century. The so-called Second Crusade, which took place after 1200, was primarily organized against the pagan Tavastians and led the Swedish crown to the Hemi region in southern Finland. This crusade was led by the Swedish kings, who also sought to control the region politically, and in the following years the Swedish monarchs continued their missionary work in Finland, establishing more churches and monasteries that served as religious and cultural centers. Another crusade in 1293 was directed against one of the largest pagan groups in Finland, the Karelians in the east. The Karelian region was strategically important as a buffer between Sweden and the powerful Grand Duchy of Moscow, and the Swedes wanted not only to spread the Christian faith in the Karelian region, but also to secure control of the border region. The Swedish Crusades in the Middle Ages had a profound impact on Finland. They fundamentally changed the Finns' pagan belief system, leading to a permanent Christianization of the population, and the Catholic Church was established as an institution in Finland, and the Diocese of Åbo, now Turku, was founded. This church played a central role in Finland's religious, cultural, and political integration into the Western world. Finland became part of the Kingdom of Sweden in the 13th century and remained under Swedish rule for almost 700 years. This long period had a profound impact on the political, social, and cultural development of the country. Swedish influence began during the Swedish Crusades in the 12th and 13th centuries, when the Swedish kings tried to spread Christianity in the Baltic region, and at the same time expand their power in the Baltic states. The first important step towards Swedish integration was taken during the reign of King Birger Jarl, who began to establish Finland as part of the Swedish Empire in the 13th century. The region was initially seen as a border region of the Kingdom of Sweden and served as a buffer against the expansion of the Russian principalities to the east. During this period, Finland was inhabited by various Finnish tribes, often in conflict with each other, and also interacting with neighboring Swedish and Russian dominions. But over time, Finland became more and more integrated into the Swedish Empire. The first Swedish administrative structures in Finland were established in the 14th and 15th centuries. Sweden introduced a feudal economic system that reorganized Finnish society. A large part of Finland was ruled by Swedish nobles, and the local population was gradually subordinated to the Swedish crown, and this political organization laid the foundations for further centralization and integration into the Swedish kingdom. Throughout the Middle Ages, Finland remained a peripheral region of the Swedish Empire, but gradually grew in importance as a strategically important region. Especially in the 16th century, under King Gustav Vasa I, Swedish control in Finland was further extended. Under Gustav Vasa, a comprehensive administrative and economic reform was initiated that brought Finland closer to the Swedish motherland. Vasa introduced centralized administration, strengthened the Swedish royal presence in Finland, and introduced Protestantism, which led to a religious and cultural upheaval. In the 17th century, during the Swedish Empire, Finland experienced a period of relative stability and growth under Swedish rule. Finland became an important province of the Swedish Empire, and cities such as Turku, Helsinki, and Vasa continued to flourish. Sweden increased the military and economic importance of the region, using Finland both as a strategic base and as an economic area for Swedish trade interests. Although Finland came under Russian rule after 1809, the cultural and institutional heritage of the Swedish period survived into the 19th century, and Finnish society was strongly characterized by Swedish legal traditions, administrative systems, and religious practices. The Swedish language was widely spoken, and most of Finland's top elite still spoke Swedish. Nearly 7 centuries of Swedish rule also left a distinct mark on Finnish identity and culture, and many of Finland's modern institutions, such as its legal system and education system, date back to the Swedish period. In addition, the influence of Protestantism introduced by Sweden is still recognized as a formative religious force in Finland today. The Treaty of Nöteborg, signed in 1323 between Sweden and the Novgorod Republic, played an important role in defining the border between the two kingdoms, essentially defining the border between the Kingdom of Sweden and the Russian Principality of Novgorod, which later became part of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. The Treaty of Nöteborg was the result of ongoing conflicts and tensions between the two powers over the control of territories in northeastern Europe, especially the Karelian region, which was of both strategic and economic importance. Novgorod wanted to protect its western borders, while Sweden was expanding its territories in the east, and the Karelians, a people living in the region, were often a strategic point of contention as they were in contact with both Novgorod and Sweden. The Treaty of Nöteborg provided for the cession of Western Karelia, then inhabited by the Karelians, to Sweden. This was an important geopolitical gain for Sweden because it secured Swedish control over another important territory to the east, but Novgorod retained most of Karelia and other neighboring territories, especially the area around Lake Ladoga, which was important for trade and control of the waterways in this part of the Baltic Sea region. The Peace of Nöteborg would not last long, however. While it laid the foundation for Sweden's eastward expansion over the next few decades, and subsequent conflicts between Sweden and Moscow and the reorganization of the territory led to further tensions, the Treaty of Nöteborg remains an important turning point in Swedish history and relations with the Russian lands, and an early example of diplomatic efforts to establish peace and demarcate borders in northeastern Europe. The Great Northern War. The Great Northern War, which lasted from 1700 to 1721, was a decisive episode in Scandinavian history with far-reaching consequences for Finland. The war between Sweden, a major power in the Baltic Sea region, and a coalition of opponents, including Russia, Denmark, and Poland, lasted for more than 2 decades and led to significant geopolitical changes, particularly affecting Finland. At the beginning of the war, Sweden controlled the Baltic Sea region and most of what is now Finland. The war began with an attack by Russia under Tsar Peter the Great, who aimed to eliminate Sweden as a regional power and secure access to the Baltic Sea. During the war, Finland was invaded several times by Russian troops. The Russian invasion in 1710, when most of Finland was conquered by the Russians, was particularly devastating, and the Swedish defenses were only able to stop the Russian advance to a limited extent, and many Finnish towns and villages were destroyed during the war. For the Finnish people, the occupation was a period of great hardship, characterized by destruction, looting, and a dramatic deterioration in living conditions. The war lasted for years and Sweden suffered many defeats. In 1321, the Treaty of Nystad ended the Great Northern War and resulted in serious territorial losses for Sweden. Finland was an important part of this loss. In the treaty, Sweden had to cede Finland to Russia, including the lands east of the Neva River, and these territorial losses marked the end of Sweden's great power status and the beginning of Russian domination in the region. Finland, previously part of the Swedish Empire, now came under Russian control and was integrated into the Russian Empire as the Grand Duchy of Finland. The consequences of the Great Northern War were far-reaching for both Sweden and Finland. Sweden not only lost its former territories in the east, but also suffered a significant political and military decline that ended Sweden's position as a great power in Europe. Finland, which had suffered greatly during the war, was now under Russian rule. This new political connection shaped Finland's history for years to come and led to a number of changes in the country's governance and culture, as Finland retained a certain autonomy as an independent Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire. The Finnish War of 1808-1809 was a decisive conflict that changed the fate and political allegiance of Finland. It took place in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, when the great powers of Europe were engaged in a complex power struggle. Sweden, which ruled Finland at the time, went to war with Russia, which wanted to expand its power in northern and eastern Europe under the leadership of Tsar Alexander I. The war began with the Russian invasion of Finland in February 1808. Sweden, which was allied with Great Britain against Napoleon during the war, could not react quickly enough to stop the Russian advance. Russia had 2 main goals: to gain strategic control over Finnish territory and to use Finland as a buffer zone against Sweden and the expanding Napoleonic France. Despite some Swedish resistance, and despite the fact that most of the Finnish population tried to preserve their independence, the war ended in disaster for Sweden. Swedish troops were unable to stop the Russian offensive, and most of Finland quickly fell under Russian control. In the winter of 1808-1809, a Swedish army that tried to assert itself in Finland was repulsed by the Russians. The war officially ended in 1809 with the Treaty of Fredrikshamn, also known as the Peace of Fredrikshamn, signed on September 17, 1809, and Sweden formally ceded Finland to Russia. Sweden was forced to relinquish all its eastern territories, thus ending its centuries-long dominance over Finland. As a result of this peace treaty, Finland was incorporated into the Russian Empire as a Grand Duchy and had a special status within the Russian Empire. Although Finland was now under Russian control, it was ruled as the Grand Duchy of Finland and was headed by its own prince, the Russian Tsar Alexander I. Finland enjoyed a certain autonomy, especially in terms of its administrative and legal systems, and was largely allowed to keep its own constitution and the Swedish legal system. But there were also a number of Russian administrative reforms and efforts to integrate the country more closely into the Russian Empire. The Grand Duchy of Finland. The Grand Duchy of Finland, which existed from 1809 to 1917, was an important period in Finnish history characterized by a unique combination of autonomy and Russian rule. After Sweden ceded Finland to Russia in the Peace of Fredrikshamn in 1809, Finland was established as an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire, and although formally part of the Russian Empire, Finland enjoyed extensive autonomy that distinguished it from other regions of the Russian Empire. The Russian Tsar was the official Grand Duke of Finland, but the country's administration was largely subject to its own system of government modeled on existing Swedish structures. A number of Swedish laws from the period of Swedish rule remained in force and were henceforth used as the basis of the Finnish legal system, which gave Finland a certain stability and allowed it to retain many of its previous traditions and administrative structures. The country had its own constitution and its own parliament, the Diet of Finland, which met for the first time in 1809. This parliament was a central body of Finnish autonomy and had the right to make laws regulating the everyday life of the Finnish population, and unlike other regions of the Russian Empire, Finland could regulate its domestic policy largely independently. It was also particularly noteworthy that Finland had its own currency and army during this period. It was under Russian control but also enjoyed a certain autonomy. Despite this broad autonomy, Finland was in many ways dependent on Russia, and its foreign policy and military defense were in the hands of the Russian Tsar. Russia sought to strengthen Finland's integration into the empire, especially in the later years of the 19th century, which led to repeated tensions as the Russian government sought to suppress Finnish identity and integrate Finnish rule more closely into the Russian system. An important turning point in this development was the so-called Russification process in the late 19th century, when Russia, under Tsar Alexander III and his successor Nicholas II, increasingly sought to integrate Finland into the Russian state structure, including measures such as the adoption of Russian as the official language and the restriction of the Finnish parliament, which at the time played a central role in the Grand Duchy's administration. These political interventions met with considerable resistance from the Finnish people and led to an intense national movement that increasingly strived for independence. The Finnish national movement, which gained great momentum in the 19th century, campaigned for the promotion of Finnish culture, language, and identity. This movement became particularly important in the second half of the century, when more and more Finns began to resist Russian tutelage. Finnish literature, art, and the education system played a key role in the formation of national consciousness. The 1835 publication of the Kalevala, Finland's national epic, which was compiled for the first time and played a symbolic role in the formation of Finnish identity, is a prime example. Despite the Russian government's attempts to integrate the Grand Duchy more closely into the Russian Empire, Finland remained largely separate from the rest of the Russian Empire during the Grand Duchy. Finnish society experienced economic progress and modernization during this period, and the population was able to live relatively free from external political and social turmoil. And as the Russian Empire weakened during the First World War, the Finnish independence movement grew stronger. Declaration of Independence. After the Russian Revolution of 1917 caused a political crisis in the Russian Empire, Finland declared its independence from Russia on December 6, 1917. At the time, Russia was in the midst of the First World War and struggling with internal political unrest that eventually led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin. The revolutionary events in Russia triggered political uncertainty that also preoccupied the Finnish people and leadership. Finland, previously an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire, found itself in a difficult situation as a result of the Russian Revolution and the subsequent power struggles between the Bolsheviks and the Provisional Russian government, and the Finnish leadership, headed by Peer Evan Svinhufvud, saw this as an opportunity to declare Finnish independence and free itself from Russian rule. On December 6, 1917, the Finnish parliament, the Diet, adopted a declaration of independence, declaring Finland's complete separation from Russia. The declaration made it clear that Finland now existed as a sovereign state and would shape its own future, a step that many Finnish politicians felt was necessary to preserve Finland's national identity and regain control of the country. The Finnish Civil War. The Finnish Civil War of 1918 was a decisive conflict in Finnish history, erupting immediately after the country gained independence from Russia. The war took place between two opposing political camps: the Red Socialist forces, supported mainly by workers and communists, and the White Conservative Monarchist forces, supported by the middle and upper classes, as well as many military and bourgeois groups. The Civil War was the result of a complex political situation exacerbated by the Russian Revolution and the social and political upheavals that accompanied it. Finland had declared independence from Russia in December 1917, but the country was deeply divided politically. The Reds demanded a socialist government inspired by the Bolsheviks in Russia, while the Whites wanted to maintain a conservative and monarchist order under the leadership of Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, and with the support of conservative forces and bourgeois groups, including the German Empire, and in January 1918 civil war broke out as the socialist Reds tried to take control of various parts of the country. Their aim was to establish a socialist republic closely linked to the revolutionary forces in Russia. On the other side were the Whites, who wanted to secure the country's independence and establish a conservative government uninfluenced by socialist ideas. The Reds initially controlled the major cities, including the capital Helsinki, as well as some industrial centers in southern Finland. They relied on the support of the working class and peasant population and tried to organize their political power by forming councils. On the other hand, the Whites had the army and a well-organized leadership under Mannerheim, a former Russian general who later became the first president of Finland, and the conflict lasted for months and was characterized by intense fighting, political instability, and bloody clashes. During the war, the Whites received increasing support from Germany, then under Kaiser Wilhelm II, which was crucial as it gave the Whites military superiority. In May 1918, the Whites defeated the Reds and took control of the country. The Whites' victory led to the establishment of a conservative government that eventually introduced a republican constitution. But the war left deep social and political divisions in Finnish society that would characterize the country for many years. The Reds were subjected to severe repression after the defeat, and thousands of supporters of the socialist movement were arrested, deported, or locked up in camps. Many Reds were killed or died in camp conditions during the war and in the post-war period. World War II. World War II was a particularly dramatic turning point for Finland, as the country was involved in two decisive wars known as the Winter War and the Continuation War. These wars shaped Finnish history and led to serious territorial losses, but also created a strong national identity and a remarkable sense of independence. The Winter War began on November 30, 1939, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland without warning. The attack took place shortly after the start of the Second World War and was part of the Soviet strategy to integrate the country into the USSR sphere of influence. The Soviet Union demanded territory from Finland, especially the strategically important Karelian Isthmus, which would provide access to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and although Finland was outnumbered, the Finnish army, led by General Carl Gustaf Emil Mannheim, put up fierce resistance. Relying heavily on guerrilla tactics and exploiting the difficult winter terrain, the Finns inflicted heavy losses on Soviet troops. The Mannheim Line, a defensive line along the Karelian Isthmus, was particularly famous for slowing the Soviet advance, and despite brave resistance and many Soviet casualties, Finland was eventually defeated militarily. After 3.5 months of fierce fighting, the two countries signed the Moscow Peace Treaty on March 12, 1940. Finland was forced to abandon large areas, including the Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viborg, and other areas in the northwest, and more than 400,000 Finnish citizens were taken as refugees from the lost territories. These territorial losses were a heavy defeat for Finland, but the Winter War strengthened national self-confidence and a sense of resistance. After Finland suffered a heavy blow during the Winter War, the geopolitical situation changed in 1941, and when the Wehrmacht attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941 in Operation Barbarossa, Finland saw an opportunity to regain the territories lost in the Winter War. Therefore, Finland entered the Continuation War on the side of Germany. This was a problematic alliance as Finland still wanted to retain its independence and did not want full integration into the Nazi system. Finland launched an offensive against the Soviet Union and in 1942 managed to regain most of the territory it had lost earlier, including the Karelian Isthmus. Finnish troops fought alongside German forces on the Eastern Front against Soviet troops, but Finland had clear objectives. It wanted to make up for its territorial losses in the Winter War and maintain its independence without wresting control from Germany, but in 1943, the military situation changed as Soviet troops began to accelerate their advance, and the Wehrmacht came under increasing pressure on other fronts. After heavy losses and a deteriorating military situation, in 1944, Finland began to negotiate an armistice with the Soviet Union. In the armistice signed in Moscow on September 19, 1944, Finland agreed to give back the captured territories and end cooperation with the Axis powers. The Continuation War ended in 1944 with heavy losses for Finland. In the Paris Peace Treaty of 1947, the country had to accept further territorial losses, including part of Karelia, the entire Petsamo region, and control of several islands in the Gulf of Finland. These territorial losses were a bitter consequence of the war and led to an upheaval in Finnish society. More than 400,000 people had to be resettled from the lost territories. Post-war period around 1944. The post-war period and the policy of neutrality. After the Second World War, Finland found itself in a difficult situation both politically and economically. The country's territorial losses during the war, military casualties, and the burden of forced resettlement of the affected population led to the need for quick and sustainable solutions to stabilize the country. In the 1947 Paris Peace Treaty, Finland had to accept further territorial losses and make a series of commitments to the Soviet Union, which was particularly important for Finland's foreign policy orientation. Although Finland remained an independent state, it had to commit to maintaining political and military neutrality in order to avoid a new conflict with the Soviet Union. From then on, this principle of neutrality became the foundation of Finnish foreign policy, and the policy of neutrality influenced Finland's foreign policy relations. At the beginning of the post-war period, under the leadership of President Juho Kusti Paasikivi and later his successor Urho Kekkonen, Finland embarked on a policy of Finlandization. This meant that the country established close economic and political relations with the Soviet Union, but at the same time tried to maintain its independence and political autonomy. Soviet influence was particularly strong, but Finland managed to circumvent it skillfully by positioning itself as a neutral buffer state between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Union. In the course of this policy, however, Finland had to accept some constraints. For example, Finland could not become a member of Western military alliances such as NATO, as this could be seen as a provocation against the Soviet Union. Instead, Finland followed its own military path, remaining a neutral country with its own defense strategy, but in direct coordination with the Soviet Union. This led to a kind of political ambiguity in which Finland was seen as neutral on the international stage, but at the same time maintained close relations with the USSR. Economically, the biggest challenge was to overcome the devastation of the war and the massive loss of territory, and Finland began to reorganize its economy in the 1950s. It was particularly important to rebuild the destroyed infrastructure and create new economic foundations. The Finnish government implemented a series of reforms aimed at transforming the country from an agricultural economy into an increasingly industrialized nation. Another important element was foreign trade. Finland maintained close economic ties with the Soviet Union, and trade with that country became an important part of the Finnish economy. However, Finland could not rely solely on trade with the Soviet Union. In the early 1960s, the country also established strong economic relations with Western countries, especially its Scandinavian neighbors and Western industrialized countries. This diversification of trade relations was an important step towards making Finland economically stable in the long term and reducing its dependence on the Soviet Union. On a political level, Finland tried to strike a balance between the Western states and the Soviet Union during this period, not leaning too heavily on either side, as seen, for example, in its attitude towards the United Nations, where it participated in international negotiations as a neutral member. Foreign policy was designed to preserve Finland's status as a neutral state, which kept it out of global power conflicts. Domestically, the Finns slowly began to heal from the post-war wounds and face challenges such as the population bearing the scars of the war years, the integration of people displaced from the lost territories, and the social and economic stabilization of the country. Nevertheless, Finland managed to establish itself as a democratic and prosperous state in the following decades. Finland joined the European Union on January 1, 1995 as a result of a long political and economic development closely linked to the geopolitical changes in Europe following the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Accession to the EU was a strategic decision that furthered Finland's integration into Western society, and consequently, the country's stabilization and modernization. Before joining the EU, Finland already had a number of bilateral agreements with the EU, especially in the areas of trade and economy. As a neutral state, Finland had also established close relations with Western countries, and the desire to continue this economic and political trajectory played an important role in the decision to join the EU. An important aspect of accession was the modernization of the Finnish economy. Joining the EU gave Finland access to the Union's single market, which meant that Finland could open its markets to European companies and take advantage of free trade within the EU, contributing to increased foreign trade and strengthening Finland's position as one of the most stable economies in Europe. The country has benefited from the single market and the promotion of innovation, especially in technology and engineering, areas in which Finland has traditionally been strong. In addition, EU membership gave Finland access to European funds and development programs, enabling the country to undertake further economic modernization. Politically, EU accession was a confirmation of Finland's shift from its previous policy of neutrality towards greater integration into Western political and economic structures. However, this was done in a way that allowed Finland to maintain its neutrality in military matters, as NATO accession was not part of the agreement. Nevertheless, joining the EU was an important step because it not only integrated Finland into the European economy, but also strengthened its political and legal orientation towards the West overall. Joining the EU was a step for Finland that not only brought economic benefits, but also provided a new political orientation and the opportunity to participate in an increasingly united and globalized world. Since its accession, Finland has used its status as a member of the Union to play an active role in European politics and to establish itself as a stable, progressive nation in Europe. After Russia's attack on Ukraine in February 2022, Finland officially applied for membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, changing its long-standing stance of military neutrality. Finland's decades-long policy of neutrality was reconsidered in light of new geopolitical challenges. The decision to join NATO was the result of an extensive political process, and Finland had long pursued a policy of military independence and remained outside military alliances. However, the country had close partnerships with NATO, especially in the field of military cooperation and participation in NATO-led missions. Russia's aggression in Ukraine and the changing security situation in Europe have led to broad support for joining NATO among the Finnish public and political class, with polls showing that a clear majority of Finns are now in favor of NATO membership. The application to join NATO was submitted in May 2022, and after intensive negotiations and diplomatic discussions, Finland was officially admitted as NATO's 31st member state on April 4, 2023. Membership not only strengthened Finland's security, but also signaled increased military cooperation and solidarity with the alliance's other member states. Joining NATO provided Finland with the alliance's collective defense guarantee, which is a fundamental security guarantee for the country in the event of an attack. Finland's accession to NATO also had far-reaching geopolitical implications. Finland, which has a long border with Russia, strengthened its military and security cooperation with Western countries by joining NATO. This represented a significant change in the security policy orientation of the country, which for decades had maintained a close but cautious relationship with Russia. At the same time, Finland emphasized that its NATO membership was not to provoke Russia, but to protect its own security and stability, making Finland's accession to NATO not only an important moment in the country's history, but also a key moment for European security as a whole. This illustrates the changing geopolitical landscape and the response to the challenges of the 21st century. In sum, Finland's history is characterized by numerous political and cultural upheavals. Originally inhabited by various indigenous peoples, Finland became part of the Kingdom of Sweden from the 12th century and remained an important part of the Swedish Empire for several centuries under Swedish rule. This long period had a strong influence on the culture and political structure of the country. In 1809, after the wars between Sweden and Russia, Finland came under Russian rule as a Grand Duchy, and Finland retained a certain degree of autonomy, which led to a gradual rise of Finnish national consciousness. As a result, a distinct cultural identity developed, reflected in literature, music, and language. This development continued until the early 20th century. Following the Russian Revolution, Finland declared independence in 1917, which immediately led to political tensions. In the Finnish Civil War of 1918, a bloody conflict between the socialist Reds and the conservative Whites, the Whites, supported by Germany, prevailed and Finland became an independent republic. But Finland soon had to deal with the geopolitical challenges of the 20th century. In 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland and the Winter War began. Despite numerical superiority and difficult conditions, Finland was able to defend most of its territory, but was forced to accept territorial losses in the Moscow Peace of 1944. In the continuation war that began in 1941, Finland tried to make up for these losses, but the war ended with another armistice in 1944. After the Second World War, Finland pursued a policy of neutrality and tried to rebuild the country. Unlike other Eastern Bloc countries, Finland maintained close economic and diplomatic relations with Western states, but remained neutral during the Cold War. In 1990, Finland managed to further develop its open market economy and joined the European Union in 1995. Later, in 1999, Finland also became a member of the Eurozone. Today, Finland is known for its high quality of life, first-class education system, and stable democracy, and the country has established itself as an economically prosperous and leading country in areas such as technology and sustainability. Finland plays an active role in international organizations such as the European Union and the United Nations, and is considered one of the safest and most noble countries.